While sequels in film and media frequently manage to recapture the magic of the original game or movie, the same can not always be said for the third installment. The curse of the threequel has surfaced time and time again. So when the follow-up to the acclaimed RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 was announced, fans of the series collectively held their breath. Things did not look great on paper. Frontier Developments was revealed as the developer, with the developer of the first two games, Chris Sawyer, only acting as a consultant. Not only that, but this entry would be the first in the series to use 3D graphics, a sharp departure from the 2D isometric perspective of the previous two games. But every once in a while, a media franchise comes along that disproves the cursed third installment theory. And upon the 2004 release of RollerCoaster Tycoon 3, it quickly became evident that the RCT franchise was one of those lucky few. Despite the new developer and graphics, the core RollerCoaster Tycoon elements that fans had come to know and love were still there, including the meticulous attention to detail in the design of each coaster type. Between the base game and the two expansion packs, RCT3 saw the addition of 23 brand new coaster types, and in this video, we'll be going through each one, trying to figure out what real-world rides inspired their inclusion. So I actually won't be going over every coaster type in RCT3, as many of them made their first appearance in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 or 2, meaning I've already covered them in my previous RollerCoaster Tycoon videos. I'll only be focusing on the coaster types new to the series from the RCT3 base game, and of course all the ones added in the Soaked and Wild expansion packs. We start things off with a Wild Mouse model, because apparently the 5 Wild Mouses, Wild Mice, from the earlier games just weren't enough for RCT3. That being said, the inverted Wild Mouse wasn't actually based off of a true Wild Mouse coaster. The odd and specific restraint system, plus the ability to execute this bizarre inversion called a saxophone, clearly point to one real-world coaster, the S&S Screaming Squirrel. Although the first Screaming Squirrel model didn't open until 2005, a prototype version of the ride was built at S&S's testing facility in 2002, and a full model in 2003. The idea behind this monstrosity was to take the hairpin turn maneuver of a traditional Wild Mouse and literally turn it on its head. At the 2004 International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions Expo, or IAAPA, S&S actually advertised the ride as a tilted Wild Mouse, hence its name in RCT3. This wacky-looking steel coaster is probably based off of a notorious prototype coaster, Aerodynamics' Pipeline roller coaster, and is the first of many concept coasters that made their way into the game. Rumor has it, the UK theme park Alton Towers was in early talks with Aero to build one as part of their first secret weapon project, but instead ended up going with another manufacturer's brand new coaster concept, and the rest is history. No other park was interested in the ride, so the only one ever built was the one at Aero's testing facility in Utah. The amusement firm Intamin did actually build one of these pipeline coasters at a hotel in Korea in the late 90s, but the ride's in-game description refers to it as a prototype coaster, so I'm pretty sure Aero was the inspiration here. The Strata coaster was of course inspired by Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point, the first coaster to break the 400-foot height barrier, and thus, the first Strata coaster. An accelerator coaster manufactured by Intamin during the literal height of the 2000s Coaster Wars, only one other Strata coaster has been built since, King Dakar at Six Flags Great Adventure, although many smaller accelerator coasters exist, one of which we'll get to shortly. This terrifying looking coaster was very likely inspired by the Tilt coaster built by Vekoma, or at least a version of it that never existed. You see, the in-game Tilt coaster not only features a standard tilt section like the one seen on Discovery World's Gravity Max, it also features a bizarre thrill lift element, where instead of using a traditional chain lift to reach the tilt section, the car and track are hoisted up a tower elevator lift style, while simultaneously rotating into the vertical drop position. Incredibly, this thrill lift element was an actual concept unveiled at the 2004 Euro Amusement Show, the same year RCT3 was released, and may have been a planned feature for future versions of the model. Unfortunately, Gravity Max was the first and only tilt coaster Vekoma ever built, and the thrill lift section never came to be. Not to be confused with the Flying Turns from RCT2, the RCT3 Flying Turns is clearly inspired by the wooden bobsled rides that once populated amusement parks in the early to mid-1900s, A famous example being the flying turns found at Chicago's Riverview Park. When RCT3 was released, this brand of coaster was ancient history, much like the Virginia Reel from RCT1. But in 2006, the flying turns was resurrected by Knoebels in Pennsylvania, making it the only wooden bobsled coaster in operation today. Sporadic operation, but operation nonetheless. So I admittedly know very little about alpine coasters, an interesting subset of coasters typically found at ski and mountain resorts. What I do know is that the German company Weigand is the king of alpine coasters, having installed nearly 300 models worldwide, including a pretty cool dueling variant, so I think I'll go with them as the inspiration. Venturing back into familiar territory, the half-pipe coaster was very likely inspired by the Intamin half-pipe coaster, the first of which debuted in 2003 as the creatively named half-pipe. Intamin actually created a new version of this simple U-shaped shuttle coaster in 2007 with their Surfrider model. Okay, so this is technically a water ride, but it's listed as a roller coaster for some reason, so we gotta talk about it. The Giant Flume is based off this shoot-the-chute style water ride built by Intamin, something they call their Mega Splash model. Two of these rides have been built, the defunct Perilous Plunge at Knott's Berry Farm in California, and Drenched, formerly known as Hydro, located at Oakwood Theme Park in Wales. I mean, yeah, this entry wasn't a very difficult one. Stormrunner at Hershey Park is actually the same type of coaster as Top Thrill Dragster, an Intamin accelerator coaster. While not nearly as tall or as fast as Dragster, it was the first accelerator coaster with inversions, resulting in the Stormrunner coaster type having a much greater variety of track pieces than its Stratocoaster counterpart. We begin to venture into obscure territory with the Sea Serpent Shuttle, a coaster type that was likely based on the Pax Cobra 1 model. Pax is a Russian manufacturer who is probably most well known for another wacky shuttle coaster, Cobra at Connieland in Switzerland. The company built 3 permanent Cobra 1 models between 1998 and 2009, including this one at Russia's Admiral Vrungel Park, the only one I could find any photos of online. I've got great news for any mini-suspended swinging coaster fans out there. CarryPro, the company behind the ride that inspired the mini-suspended swinging coaster in RCT1, gets their second in-game representation with the Skyrider, a coaster type based off their Gyro Flyer model. Only one of these models was ever built, Skyrider at Skyline Park in Germany. Things only get better for all of those mini-suspended swinging coaster fans. Setpoint, the company that worked with CarryPro to build Islands of Adventure's Pterodon Flyers coaster, designed a couple mini-suspended coasters of their own, including Hershey Park's Roller Soaker, a unique coaster where riders had the ability to drop buckets of water onto unsuspecting guests below. A couple manufacturers make motorbike coasters, but only one was manufacturing them around the time RCT3 was released. Everyone's favorite Dutch manufacturer, Vekoma. Because of that, the Turbobikes was probably inspired by Vekoma's first motorbike coaster, 2004's Booster Bike, located at Toverland. The fourth flying coaster model to join the series, the Glider Coaster, looks to take inspiration from the painful Volare model manufactured by the Italian ride maker Zamperla. These rides are approaching 2 decades of torture, with the first debuting at Elitch Gardens in 2002. The 2005 Wild expansion pack brought some truly wild coaster types into the mix, and is without a doubt the most obscure collection of rides in the series' history. I always thought that some of these coaster types were made up by the developers of Frontier, but it turns out that every single one existed at some point in real life or as a concept. We begin with the Coaster Ball, which seems to resemble the real-life Intamin Zackspin, so that must be what inspired it, right? Well, there are 2 issues with this theory. The first and most blatant issue is that the original Zackspin didn't open until 2007, 2 years after the release of Wild. The less obvious second problem is that all Intamin Zackspins use a chain lift to start off the ride, while the in-game Coaster Ball has no access to chain lift pieces and can only be launched out of the station via linear synchronous motors, or LSMs. So, what's going on here? Turns out, the Coaster Ball wasn't inspired by the Intamin Zackspin, but was instead probably inspired by an earlier version of the Zaxspin that Intamin showed off at the 2005 Euro Attraction Show, something they called the Ball Coaster, hence the name in RCT3. This prototype version of the Zaxspin was intended to have an LSM launch just like it does in the game, but potential customers were put off by the demanding LSM system, and a chain lift was used on future models. Much like the coaster ball, the Dizzy Dropper has an interesting backstory. In 2004, the same year that Hershey Park debuted Stormrunner, Hershey announced that they'd be installing a new coaster called Turbulence for the 2005 season. This ride is probably what inspired the Dizzy Dropper in RCT3, whose developers apparently really had a thing for Hershey Park. The ride was designed by Interactive Rides, but was never built due to a dispute over the cost of the project. 14 years later in 2018, the concept was revived by the company Ride Engineers Switzerland, who has now built 3 of these Turbulence-esque models. The easy answer as to what inspired the drifting coaster is the Maurer Rides X-Car model, the first opening at Drayton Manor in 2005. But none of the real-world X-Cars swing out around turns like they do in the drifting coaster, so what's going on here? Turns out, Maurer Rides once advertised a drifting X-Car model as early as 2003. It looks as if this idea never panned out though, as any mention of the drifting X-Car has been taken off of Maurer Rides' website. A little bonus fact, they also advertised this ridiculous looking spinning X-Car, something that unfortunately never made it into RCT or real life. AKA the best coaster type in the game, the extended coaster is another interesting case, appearing to take inspiration from multiple sources. The default trains for the ride are directly inspired by the trains found on Maurer Rides' X-Car coasters, but without the drifting effect, of course. However, the in-game track is identical to the track used on other Bolliger and Mabillard inspired coaster types, with Bolliger and Mabillard trains being secondary options behind the X-Cars. In the end, the extended coaster, with its incredible range of track pieces and varied train options, seems to have been included as a parting gift to RCT3 players from Frontier, the ultimate coaster type where the player's dream design, or a peep's worst nightmare, can be brought to life. To understand what the robotic coaster was based off of, we first have to talk about KUKA, a German manufacturer of industrial robots and factory automation systems. In 2001, KUKA was approached by RoboCoaster Ltd, a British amusement design firm, and together they created the RoboCoaster G1. Despite having coaster in its name, the G1 version of the RoboCoaster does not look or behave like your traditional coaster, and is essentially just a stationary KUKA arm that riders are attached to. At the 2004 IAAPA Expo, KUKA teamed up with Dynamic Attractions, a ride systems manufacturer who worked on rides such as Disney's Test Track and Soarin' over California, to unveil the RoboCoaster G2. The second-gen RoboCoaster was essentially a 4-seater KUKA arm attached to a traditional 3-dimensional coaster track, and is clearly what inspired the robotic coaster in RCT3. While a true robotic coaster was never built, KUKA and Dynamic Attractions did end up constructing a different version of their second-gen RoboCoaster, where KUKA arms run along a flat 2-dimensional track past various show scenes. That ride opened in 2010 to critical acclaim as Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey at Universal's Islands of Adventure. One of the most out there coaster types in RCT3 has got to be the rotating tower coaster. Just like the robotic coaster, it too is based off of a concept. But unlike the robotic coaster, not much came out of the idea, which makes sense as the whole rotating tower mechanism looks incredibly complicated. After some digging online, I'm fairly confident that the rotating tower coaster was based off of this 2004 patent by legendary coaster designer Werner Stengel. I couldn't find any concept art or trade show announcements relating to this concept, so if you know anything more about this ride, let me know in the comments. The spinning steel is probably the most recognizable coaster type in the Wild expansion, having been based off of the relatively popular spinning coaster built by the German manufacturer Mach Rides. 12 of these models have been built at parks all over the world, with the first being Euromur at Europa Park in 1997. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out Adventureland's Turbulence for all the Long Islanders out there. Out of all of the crazy coaster types introduced in the RCT3 expansion packs, this one might just take the cake as the most wild. And believe it or not, it was inspired by an actual coaster concept. Mini suspended swinging coaster fans, you might want to sit down for this one because the splitting coaster concept was unveiled by none other than Setpoint, the company behind Roller Soaker and Pterodon Flyers. According to old forum threads, Setpoint apparently announced the concept at the 2000 IAAPA Expo, but I could find almost no other information about it online, aside from this low-res concept image. Despite looking as or more ridiculous than some of the concept coasters on this list, the Towering Coaster is based off of a coaster model that actually existed. Built by the Italian manufacturer SBF Visa, known worldwide for those tiny hamster ball spinning coasters, and named the Tower Coaster, I believe it made its first appearance on the European Fair circuit in 2003. While SBF Visa had plans for larger, more permanent versions of the Tower Coaster, none were ever built, which is understandable considering how janky the thing looks. The developers at Frontier must have been massive coaster nerds. There were a bunch of coaster types that I knew very little to nothing about before making this video, and I consider myself to be a pretty big coaster geek. Kudos to the RCT3 developers for staying on top of all of the latest amusement park trends coming out of the trade shows each year, and managing to translate those concepts into the game. Which of these concept coasters would you want to see built someday? Let me know in the comments below. Oh, and be sure to like this video if you want to help me out in my battle against the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. Until next time, thanks for watching.